Okay, well, welcome again, everyone, and thanks for joining us here at Lighthouse Lab Services for today's webinar. Today, we'll be covering the topic of, is your lab director doing their job? Our presenters today will be Tara Llewellyn, Lighthouse's Vice President of Lab Director Services, and Dr. Sierra Sharp with our Quality Manager team and a lab director herself. Just wanted to briefly touch on a few housekeeping items before we cover our agenda for today. This webinar will be recorded and sent out to everyone after the conclusion, so no need to ask for slides or the recording. You'll receive that automatically as part of your registration. Throughout the webinar, you'll notice that there is a chat box as well as a Q&A box. If you have any questions, we encourage you to put those in the Q&A. Our speakers will see them there, and if they are able to respond to them, any answers they provide will be published and become visible for the rest of the group. If they aren't able to address the subject right away, we will have a separate Q&A portion at the end of the webinar, and they may be able to address those at this time or at that time. We'll be running polls and handout offers throughout the webinar, so if you see any pop-ups, feel free to respond to those questions or click through for requests for more information. If you're not interested in any of those items, you can just exit out as they appear. And we currently have a couple handouts available right now in the handout section if you'd like to look at more information about our full-time lab director placement or just an overview on our lab director services program. So for our agenda today, we'll be starting out covering the lab director responsibilities from CLIA's perspective, duties that can and cannot be delegated. We'll also be covering lab director responsibilities from a firsthand perspective. Dr. Sharp will be going over that. We'll be discussing what makes a good lab director, looking at CLIA requirements and how these have changed in recent years and how they can change from various state to state as well. We'll be discussing some best practices for hiring a lab director and then going over some tips from Tara for working with a recruiter. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Sharp.
Hello, everyone. I wanted to start today's webinar by going over the CLIA-defined responsibilities of the lab director, as this is important to understanding what the lab director actually needs to do and if they're actually doing their job. So CLIA breaks down the responsibilities of the lab director into 5 categories listed here: the general, procedural, personnel management, proficiency testing, quality control, and quality assurance. So we'll be going in more depth into each of these topics, but I wanted to note here that some accreditation agencies such as CAP and COLA and individual states may have additional responsibilities that aren't covered in the scope of this webinar. Today, I'm really only focusing what is set forth by CLIA. Under the general responsibilities category, CLIA requires that the lab director be accessible to all laboratory staff. Many lab directors work remotely, so this accessibility is usually via phone or email. Again, CLIA does not have a specific requirement for the lab director being physically on site at the laboratory, but this may vary by accreditation agency or state. The lab director is also responsible for ensuring environmental conditions and that these are appropriate for testing. This really covers 2 separate requirements, with the first being general safety. It's important that there is adequate space and ventilation and that safety precautions are in place so that laboratory personnel can perform their jobs with minimal risk. The second part of this is the environmental conditions are required for meeting the operating parameters for instruments used within the laboratory. At bare minimum, this includes temperature and humidity checks. Ultimately, the lab director is responsible for the overall administration and operation of the laboratory. The lab director will often be called in to consult and advise on issues dealing with staffing, how to handle increased testing volumes while maintaining defined turnaround times, and keeping in mind the overall financial goals of the laboratory. Before going into the more specialized responsibilities of the lab director, I'd like to note here that the lab director can actually delegate some of their duties to other lab personnel, which brings us to the duties that can and can't be delegated per CLIA. The lab director cannot delegate quality or safety of the laboratory. the lab director is responsible for making sure their own duties are performed and that the lab is only performing testing within the scope of their complexity designation. The lab director is responsible for the overall quality of the laboratory, and so even if a duty is delegated, it is ultimately up to the lab director to see that it is completed. As I cover the rest of these CLIA-defined responsibilities, those that can be delegated will be emphasized with an asterisk. The procedural responsibilities of the lab director focus mainly on the actual testing performed at the laboratory. The overall quality of the lab covers the pre-analytical, analytical, and post-analytical phases of testing. And one of the common ways a lab director will work to ensure quality is by developing a standardized operating procedures that cover all of these phases. These SOPs, as they are commonly referred to, are housed in a procedure manual that is readily available to all lab staff, and these set the expectations for how duties should be performed. A large portion of the procedural responsibilities are to make sure that the test methods used in the laboratory can provide accurate results. The first step in this process is either the verification or validation of the methods performed in the laboratory prior to patient testing. In addition, accuracy can be assessed throughout the year by proficiency testing, calibration verification, if applicable, and inter-instrument studies if the laboratory is using more than one of the same instrument for the same test. Finally, the lab director will have to check that the patient report includes all pertinent information a physician would need to interpret results provided. This can include reference ranges, or for qualitative testing, you will often see cutoffs for positivity. Typically, this is performed by a review of a finalized test report prior to the lab going live with testing. So under the umbrella of personnel management, the lab director works to employ a sufficient number of staff. At bare minimum, the lab director needs to make sure that the laboratory covers all minimum required CLIA roles. This includes a clinical consultant, technical supervisor, or technical consultant, depending on the complexity designation of the laboratory, general supervisor, and testing personnel. Considerations for appropriate staffing should also include the test volume and expected turnaround times. During the hiring process, credentials should be reviewed so that all employees meet CLIA educational and experience requirements for their specified roles. Once hired, the lab director will be responsible for training of the individual, although this is a common area that is often delegated to either the technical or general supervisor. After the initial training of testing personnel, competency checks are performed at the 6-month, annual, and annually thereafter. Again, I want to highlight that performing the competencies can be delegated, but ultimately the lab director is responsible for making sure that these are completed in a timely manner. Finally, the lab director defines the roles and responsibilities of the lab personnel and maintains written record of this. And this is especially important if the lab director does end up delegating duties to other lab staff. These responsibilities are often outlined in a job description that is signed by the employee and filed in the laboratory. As previously mentioned, proficiency testing is one of the ways to ensure accuracy of results produced by the laboratory and is a requirement for CLIA and accreditation agencies. The lab director is responsible for enrolling the laboratory in an HHS-approved PT program that is appropriate for the lab's test menu, and for any analytes that may not be covered by commercially available PT programs, alternative assessment is often required. For all proficiency testing samples, the lab director ensures that they are tested in the same manner as patient samples, that they are not referred to another laboratory, and that results are not discussed prior to evaluation. The lab director will also need to coordinate with lab staff to ensure that the proficiency testing results are submitted in a timely manner. Once the evaluation of results is received from the proficiency testing provider, the lab director should review all results and perform any necessary corrective and preventative action for any analytes that are considered unsatisfactory. Oftentimes, this will require the involvement of the technical and general supervisor and the person who actually performed testing on the proficiency testing samples to determine the root cause of failure. Finally, CLIA requires that the lab director develops a quality system consisting of both a quality control and quality assurance program. Together, these are used to identify any failures in quality as they occur. For the QC program, it's important that the lab director defines the type of QC to be used and how often QC should be performed in the laboratory. Again, this is going to vary based on the testing performed by the laboratory. So while QC is used to maintain quality on a day-to-day basis, the QA program is meant to provide an overarching approach to maintaining quality, and this touches all aspects of testing, so the pre-analytical, analytical, and post-analytical phases, and the QA program provides a way to review and revise how these phases are performed when issues arise. Along with this, the lab director must maintain acceptable levels of analytical performance, and as I previously discussed, this is done through the initial method verification or validation, and semi-annual checks, which include proficiency testing at minimum. It's important for the lab director to make it clear to all lab staff that patient results can only be reported when the test system is in check. And one of the easiest ways of making sure this is the case is through running QC prior to any patient samples. If QC fails, this is a pretty good indicator that there is an issue with the system that needs to be addressed. Finally, in instances where there is a quality failure, the lab director will initiate corrective and preventive action processes. This involves, first, the identification of the root cause of failure, secondly, a plan for correcting the failure, and any necessary actions that need to take place, and finally, a way to assess if the actions implemented actually prevented the failure from happening again. So now that we have a basic understanding of what CLIA requires from the lab director, I thought it would be useful to see what these responsibilities look like from a lab director's perspective. For some general background, I serve as the lab director for 4 laboratories. All of these laboratories perform high complexity testing, and it's a mixture of toxicology, infectious disease, and basic chemistry. So 2 of my laboratories are CLIA accredited and the other 2 are CLIA. So each lab is going to have its own unique set of requirements. As a caveat here, my experience is a little bit different because I get access to the wonderful resources provided by Lighthouse Lab Services, which includes our quality team, a consulting team, LIS support, and instrument support. But in general, the duties I perform are listed here. So for personnel competencies, I delegate these to the technical supervisor. However, I still remain responsible for performing competencies for the technical supervisor themselves. Once the technical supervisor has completed the competencies for all testing personnel, I review all the paperwork and I will sign off on it. And I'm also responsible for maintaining the calendar of when these competencies are due. For proficiency testing, I review all unsatisfactory results, but I also look for trends for analytes that may technically be passing but have a bias on either the low or high end of the acceptable peer group range. For unsatisfactory results, I will work with the technical supervisor to develop a corrective action plan. And for those analytes that pass but aren't performing well, I will develop a preventive action plan to avoid failures in the future. On a monthly basis, I review all quality control records, maintenance logs, and temperature and humidity logs. If there are any issues, I will work with a technical supervisor to initiate proper corrective action. I also oversee the quality assurance program for my laboratories. I have delegated most of this to the technical supervisor, which consists of filling out a quality assurance form once a month that assesses areas such as personnel records, analytical systems, proficiency testing, and LIS verification. And at the end of the month, once these forms have been completed, I will review and initiate any corrective action if needed. I also serve as a consultant for any technical issues or questions about test results, and this requires that I work closely with both the clinical consultant and the technical supervisor of the laboratory. For my procedural responsibilities, I review the laboratory standard operating procedures on an annual basis, and I will update these procedures based on changes in accreditation requirements or if there are areas for workflow improvement. For all laboratory inspections, I coordinate with the technical and general supervisor to provide a list of all documentation that is needed. The day before the inspection, I will go to laboratory and perform a mock audit to ensure that all documents have been appropriately reviewed and signed. I also provide support on site for the day of the actual inspection. If the inspector identifies any deficiencies, I'm the one responsible for putting together the plan of action to correct these deficiencies. Finally, I wanted to end with a top 10 list of what I personally think makes a good lab director. The first is to have a good line of communication with staff, and this communication shouldn't be a one-way street, and staff should feel comfortable coming to the lab director with any kind of issue, even before problems occur. The second is the lab director needs to have a solid understanding of what duties can be delegated, and I hope that some of these duties have been highlighted throughout my presentation. The lab director should know all equipment or instrumentation that is being used by a laboratory and have a basic understanding of testing principles and how this instrumentation works. This really helps with any technical issues and can help with root cause investigation. Laboratory directors should have a basic understanding of statistics. This is extremely important for assessing quality control data and proficiency testing results. The lab director should be familiar with the whole testing menu and make sure all analytes are covered by commercial proficiency testing programs or alternative assessment. The lab director should also understand the personnel needs for the laboratory. So like I said, this takes into account the type of testing being performed, the sample volume, and the turnaround time. It can also mean that the lab director employs people who have a strong knowledge background in the testing being performed. For example, I don't have a very strong background in infectious disease testing, so it's important to me that my laboratories that perform this kind of testing have a technical supervisor that has a strong background in molecular techniques. It's also important for the lab director to develop a system for customer interaction or complaints. A lot of the quality issues are identified by the customer, so it's important to have their feedback. And typically, this system is included as part of the quality assurance program. A good lab director will provide guidance in preparation for inspections, whether this is just sending a list of items that need to be updated to the technical or general supervisor, or actually going on site to perform the mock audit themselves. This is a really good way to help catch the small items that may be cited as a deficiency during the actual inspection. As with most jobs, a good lab director should have excellent time management and be able to dedicate time not only when issues in the lab arise. This is especially important to keep in mind as lab directors often direct multiple laboratories and can direct up to 5 non-wave laboratories at a given time. Finally, the lab director should have a solid understanding of their accreditation and state requirements. Again, this will help avoid any deficient practices before they even occur. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I will be available at the end of Tara's presentation for any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Sharp. I think that was really helpful to hear both about your firsthand perspective as a lab director and also to dive into the CLIA expectations and requirements. And I see that we have a question from Samir about a delegation of a specific duty. Perhaps Dr. Sharp can answer that while I'm presenting, or maybe can address that at the end. And feel free to, like Alex said, put your questions there so that we can either address them during the course of this or at the end, either one. I'm going to start by giving a broad overview of what CLIA expects in terms of the qualifications of a laboratory director. And this is very broad, like Dr. Sharp mentioned. There are some specific requirements by states, by accrediting body, but this is in general what CLIA is requiring of the qualifications for a laboratory director. So in general here, I've thrown up on the slides the differences in qualifications between a high complexity laboratory director and a moderate complexity laboratory director. Generally speaking, a high complexity laboratory director has a doctoral degree, so PhD, an MD, a DO, or a DPM, plus a board certification. And of course, if that lab director is an MD, a DO, or a DPM, that person would also need a medical license for the state in which the lab is located. And you can see for the differences there in moderate complexity requirements in that it's more about education plus appropriate experience supervising non-wave testing. That combination will qualify someone to be a laboratory director of a moderate complexity lab. There are also some differences in terms of requirements for different accrediting bodies, such as COLA and CAP, like Dr. Sharp mentioned, as well as other agencies like SAMHSA, Joint Commission, and things like that. And some of the states that have specific requirements include New York, Tennessee, California, etc. How have these qualification requirements changed in recent years? One of the big differences that has changed in terms of what CLIA requires of a qualified laboratory director, and I'm speaking in terms of a high complexity qualified lab director here, is a board certification. A board certification wasn't originally required when CLIA first came about and put out the requirements for a laboratory director, but it is something that they do require now of all high complexity qualified lab directors. Some of you may be familiar with what we used to call grandfathered in status. And what that was someone who had a doctoral degree and was recognized for having experience enough to direct a lab or for qualifying as a lab director prior to a certain date. And unfortunately, both CLIA and COLA are no longer recognizing new lab director affiliations for lab directors that are grandfathered in. And basically what that means is that they don't hold a board certification. There's no impact to lab directors who are grandfathered in, so those who lack a board certification, with the labs that they are already affiliated with. So if you yourself are a lab director who lacks a board certification and are grandfathered in as a result, so long as you maintain your affiliation as the CLIA lab director for that lab, there's no issue. They're not going to say you can no longer direct this lab or anything, at least at this point. However, as of last year, both CLIA and COLA began essentially denying lab directors that would have previously been categorized as grandfathered in and who lack that board certification to be approved as a lab director of a high complexity lab. And I actually communicated with some people at both some of the CLIA offices and COLA representatives to ask about this change and to clarify that change as it was happening last year. And basically what I was told was that it's never really meant to be a long-term solution. Once they decided that board certification was necessary, that's the way that they wanted to move toward in terms of the qualifications required of a lab director. And so last year they came to the conclusion that it was time to do away with the grandfathered status. And so they are no longer recognizing new affiliations, like I said, with grandfathered lab directors and labs. Essentially, what this has turned into is that, labs are required more stringently to have a lab director with certain qualifications. And, we are also seeing that training programs of lab directors are becoming more and more specialized. Like Dr. Sharp mentioned, given her background in toxicology and she doesn't have a lot of infectious disease experience, she wants to ensure that the other staff members in her labs that do that kind of testing have a strong background. And so we're seeing a lot of the training programs for even these higher level positions, like high level scientists and lab directors, becoming more and more specialized to where they're focusing on one particular area. And that might be infectious disease, that might be toxicology, that might be something totally different, but they are becoming more and more specialized. So this leads us to our conclusion that, the requirements are both more stringent, the training programs are becoming more specialized, and so we may need to take a special approach to hiring a lab director. And the first thing that you want to consider when you are deciding to hire a lab director or a new lab director is your part-time versus full-time need. This is very important for a lab because there's a large overhead cost for hiring a full-time lab director. And oftentimes, like Dr. Sharp mentioned, a part-time lab director who's mostly remote can meet the needs that you have. As she detailed, there are some differences in terms of lab director execution. There are delegated duties when the lab director is part-time or remote, and they have obviously lesser involvement with the lab. In my experience, I think that most small to moderately sized laboratories benefit well from a part-time lab director. But if you are looking for a more hands-on, boots on the ground, business-minded leader of your laboratory to help launch you into the next stages of your facility, to grow it and to stay on the cutting edge of new technologies, new testing, your laboratory is probably going to better benefit from a full-time lab director. Basically, to sum that up, with the requirements becoming more stringent, candidate programs becoming more specialized, again, we need to take a special approach for hiring a lab director. And I want to talk about some best practices and some tips for hiring your perfect lab director. I've put up on the slide there a couple of things that you can use as a jumping off point to essentially set your lab director position apart. You want to stand out to attract these high level candidates because, going back to the more stringent requirements, the more specialized programs, that essentially equates to a smaller candidate pool that is appropriately qualified and available to work with you in this capacity. So here's a few things that you can do to make your lab director position stand out amongst competitors. Compensation is a big one. I counsel a lot of clients on how to appropriately pay their lab director, and this is in terms of a full-time lab director typically. But what we're seeing currently in the industry is that a full-time lab director is going to make somewhere between 3 and 4 times what your medical technologist probably makes. I know that seems like a lot of money. Again, small candidate pool, it equates to, you know, them being a higher demand for their services, and there's less supply there with the more specialized training. So you do have to offer a competitive package to these level of individuals. The base salary is certainly important, but it's not the only factor. And even if you have a salary that is within industry standard and is competitive, you're going to need to round out your compensation package with other options and other perks, so to speak, to make your position stand out amongst your competitors. Usually we're seeing a lab director offered a bonus structure, which is 10 to 20% of their base salary. One thing that I counsel my clients to do is to tie this to their performance. This helps to lessen the impact or risk to the company in terms of its financial offerings for this individual. If you're tying performance to the bonus that they are receiving, then obviously that can mean that the lab is growing, the lab has more sample volume, whatever the goal is that you've set there. To reflect that, you know, that higher compensation makes sense for your business fiscally also. Lab directors are also used to seeing a 401k or a retirement plan offered and full benefits, of course, to this level of individual. Relocation is something that I encourage my clients to offer for a full-time lab director. This shows upfront investment in the candidate, but it's without a huge cost to the company. Usually a relocation package for a lab director is going to be less than $10,000. And that's a one-time, essentially bonus that you can offer the lab director to show that you understand that relocating for this position is not easy, and helps out with that cost, as well as, you know, kind of welcomes them to your team. And that cost is usually less than 5% of their salary. And again, it's just that one time. Another thing to set your position apart and to hire someone that will meet your needs is to be as flexible as possible in terms of both the credentials that you're requiring and the location of where the services are rendered. Let's start out with the credentials. So we talked about what CLIA requires for high complexity lab directors versus moderate complexity. And I'm talking here in terms of a high complexity full-time lab director. But define what you absolutely need and what is a preference. In my intake calls with clients, a lot of times they will tell me, well, I would really prefer to work with a pathologist. And I dive into that with them. You know, why is it that that's your preference? Because if you consider a board certified PhD, for example, that opens up the candidate pool. because like I mentioned, the candidate pool is small, not a lot of people to choose from. So we want to make that candidate pool of the people that they're considering for this position as large as possible so that they make the right hire. And I would also encourage all of my clients to talk to or interview candidates who meet their required profile. Once you've dug down into that, what are the absolute requirements you have to have for your state, your accrediting body, and your testing? Interview the people that meet that required profile, even if they don't fit all of the preferences that you would ideally love to have in a hire. A good recruiter will point out the ways that the candidates do and don't meet your particular preferences when they are submitting that person for your review. So having a conversation with your recruiter about what requirements are met, what preferences are met and not met, and the pros and cons of that will help you make a successful hire as well. And then location is a big one. We're seeing a lot of people working from home now, and that extends to lab directors. We heard Dr. Sharp talk about how she completes most of her duties as a part-time lab director for her 4 labs remotely. We're seeing a lot of remote work now, and even folks who are interested in a full-time lab director position are asking for a lot of their work to be done remotely, even when they already live in the area where the lab is located. So we're seeing a big shift to the work from home, even in these higher level lab positions where that is an option. A lot of states have a certain on-site visit requirement, or there are a few states anyway that have that on-site visit requirement. And of course, the lab director needs to be visiting frequently enough to ensure the compliance and to have the interaction with the staff and the communication there and to address any issues. But if there's a way that you can create this position that has a day or 2 on site a week, or regular visits if the person is not actually located in the area, we're seeing a lot more success in terms of hiring a high level person for this type of role now, if that flexibility is offered. We recently had a client that actually hired somebody completely remotely, and this lab is not in a state that has a specific on-site visit requirement, but they want their lab director to visit every month. And so we helped them with an arrangement that their hired full-time lab director works basically remotely, is very available to them and their staff, but comes on site every single month to meet those needs that they have. So it sounds like we're asking for a lot, right? Us recruiters here. Flexibility, high compensation package, work from home, like it is a lot. And I get that. But we've really found over the past several months, especially, that this is the ideal recipe to attract top level talent that will drive your future increased growth for the lab and your company, which will also equate to profitability and potential expansion of your lab and your business ultimately. I wanted to offer a few little statistics here. We're hearing about what people are calling the Great Resignation happening right now, and we're seeing this in the lab industry as well. Essentially, 11.5 million people quit their jobs between April, May, and June of this year. And recent surveys in the United States and abroad are showing somewhere between 40 and 50% of employees are actively looking for new jobs. The pandemic has caused us to take a big step back and look at the job that we're doing and how that fulfills us and our happiness, and if we are fulfilled in our work. And that has a lot to do with motivation and output and efficiency. So Lighthouse and recruiters like us are here to help you attract and retain the top talent, and using some of these tips and using some of these ideas in terms of flexibility, compensation, relocation, things like that. Show the candidates that you care, you're invested in them as a company, and those are the kinds of companies and labs that candidates want to work with and for. So a couple of tips for working with recruiters. I thought we would go over those just in general. This doesn't have to be for a lab director specifically, but it works for that type of hire as well. I know a lot of people have had poor experiences working with recruiters, or know someone who's had a horror story working with a recruiter. It's been way more frustrating than it has been helpful. That's not how it should be. Working with a recruiter should make the hiring of a qualified candidate easier, not harder, on you. And I'd like to tell you some tips as a recruiter that helps me do a better job as a recruiter for my clients. And there's basically two big takeaways here. One is work with someone who's familiar with your specific industry. Lighthouse is obviously niched into the lab industry specifically. We don't serve other industries. That helps us to stay abreast of the changes in the regulations as it applies to personnel, lab directors in particular, because these state by state regulations can change. Like I mentioned earlier, the CLIA and the COLA determination that they're no longer going to accept grandfathered in lab directors. We're able to stay on top of those changes because we're in the lab industry, and that's the industry we're specialized in, and we're not working in various other industries. You can't really learn a specific industry by doing one search, and the lab industry is an especially good example of that because of all the nuance there. And then the other thing that you can do to make your interaction with the recruiter and the recruiting process much easier as a result is just to provide feedback. And that's early and that's often. So I encourage my clients to be brutally honest with me. I want all that transparent information as to why they are passing on this particular candidate, why they want to interview this other candidate. That helps me adjust my search. You can be brutally honest with me as a client of mine, and I'm not going to go back to any candidates and, put them off, so to speak. I'll find a way to soften it if you're declining candidates or you don't want to move forward with them for any reason. Good recruiters find a way to soften that feedback back to the candidate. And honestly, we deliver that feedback to candidates way more often than we get to offer them jobs. So we're really good at this. Provide us the honest feedback, and you don't have to worry that we're going to go back to the candidate and run our mouth, so to speak, about what you said. On the contrary, actually, is what we'll probably do as a good recruiter is to utilize that feedback to also train and help that candidate become a better candidate in terms of for their next interview. So providing the feedback early, as soon as you review a candidate resume, as soon as you talk to a candidate via phone screen, as soon as you interview that candidate or in person or over the phone or Zoom, and then often, so as things change with your search or within your company, providing that feedback helps good recruiters adjust to find you the best possible fit for the individual that you ultimately hire. Again, the early feedback is really important because you want to jump on the chance to work with candidates that are great candidates. They are scooped up really fast currently, given that the demand is more than the supply. So you want to provide feedback to your recruiter early so as not to miss out on working with great candidates. And then again, often after every time you receive a resume, review that resume, give your honest feedback, and that recruiter can adjust from there so that they're not wasting your time with candidates that are similar in profile, but not going to meet your needs or your ideal preferences. So those are just a few tips in general that I have for working with recruiters and a broad overview of how to navigate the process of hiring a lab director. And of course, we here at Lighthouse would love to assist you with your questions, with your lab director search, or with anything that we can. So I think we're going to open up the webinar for Q&A now, and both Dr. Sharp and myself will be available to answer any questions that you may have with regard to lab directors or recruiting in general.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tara, and Dr. Sharp as well. Both very informative in your various sections. Like Tara said, our Q&A is open. We did have one question that we responded to earlier, but if there are any last-minute questions, feel free to pop those in now, and we'll do our best to get them answered. If you don't have anything for us now, but want to potentially follow up later, the contact info for doing so is on the Q&A slide in front of you. You may also go to the handout section to download our 2 handouts, and contact info is available on there as well. So I'm not seeing any additional questions. So if you have anything else, just reach out to us via email. But if not, thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. And I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up now. Thanks again to Dr. Sharp and Tara for their time.